I never thought my family would betray me so cruelly. My life resembled a perfect picture. I had a wife whom I considered my soulmate, my partner in everything, from daily concerns to major life decisions. She wasn't just my wife, but my best friend, the person I planned to spend my entire life with. My father was my hero. You know the type of father. Strong, wise, the one who is always there with advice or support. He was someone I looked up to as an example. When things got tough, I could call him in the middle of the night, and he would always have the right words. Our relationship was more than just familial. It was a genuine friendship. My wife and I loved spending time with my father. He often came over for dinner, and we'd laugh together, talk about plans, and share stories. Our home was filled with an atmosphere of love and trust. I even joked with friends that my life was like a movie script with a happy ending. But one day, one single day, all of it came crashing down. You know that moment when you suddenly feel like the ground beneath your feet begins to crack? That was the day I first felt that something wasn't right. It started with little things. My wife became a bit distant. She spent more time on her phone than talking to me. She started staying late at work, though she used to always rush home. Her smile, once so genuine, began to feel forced. I asked myself, did I do something wrong? Then stranger things started happening. My father began visiting us more frequently than usual, and every time he and my wife were alone together, even for a few minutes, there was an awkward silence between them. They tried to act naturally, but I could feel that something in their behavior had shifted. One day, I came home earlier than usual. The house was unusually quiet. I saw my wife quickly hide her phone, as if there was something she didn't want me to see. I asked, "What's going on?" She simply replied, "Nothing. Everything's fine," but her voice was tense. That was the moment I knew. This wasn't just stress or fatigue. Something was happening, something that would turn my life upside down. Have you ever felt like the truth is somewhere nearby, but you're too afraid to face it? That's exactly what I was feeling. I didn't know what awaited me, but deep down, I understood that my life would never be the same. I was standing on the edge of something monumental, something that would change my perception of love, trust, and family forever. But I didn't yet know how devastating this truth would be. When I think about my relationship with my wife, the first thing that comes to mind is how close we were. She wasn't just my wife. She was my whole world. We met when I was an entirely different person, less confident, less focused. She was the one who helped me become the person I am today. We were the kind of couple people would call perfect. Our friends always admired how we supported each other. Together, we made plans for the future, buying a house, traveling to new countries, even talking about having kids. It was something special, and I thought it would never end. My father was also an integral part of this perfect life. He was more than just a father to me. He was my hero. He was the person who was always there for me, supporting me during tough times, teaching me how to be strong, how to build a career and a family. I always felt proud to tell my friends about how amazing my dad was. He often told me, "Family is the most important thing you can have in this life. Take care of it." And I believed him. My father was the one I turned to for advice when my wife and I had minor disagreements. He always had the right words, helping us find compromises. His experience and wisdom were a guiding light for me. But gradually, something started to change. You know how it feels when everything seems perfect, but at some point, you sense something inexplicable in the air? It's like an invisible thread that slowly starts to unravel. Everything started with small things. My wife began staying late at work more frequently. I joked about it. "Are you working more hours than your boss now?" She laughed in response, but her laughter felt forced. She always said it was just stress, but there was a tone in her voice that I hadn't noticed before. What surprised me even more was how often my father started coming over. Of course, I was always happy to have him around, but it was happening so frequently that I started wondering to myself, what keeps bringing him to our house so often? I remember one specific moment that seemed insignificant at the time, but now I realize it was the first sign. It was during dinner. The three of us were sitting together, me, my wife, and my father. We were talking about some everyday topics, and I noticed the way my father looked at my wife. It wasn't the usual fatherly look I was used to seeing. There was something different in his eyes, something that made me feel slightly uneasy. But I ignored it, thinking it was just my imagination. As time went on, I started noticing more things. For example, when my father came over, he sometimes stayed longer than usual. I noticed how he and my wife would stay in another room together if I stepped out to take a phone call. When I came back, they would abruptly fall silent or change the subject of their conversation. One day, I overheard them talking in the kitchen, but when I walked in, they stopped talking immediately. They tried to act natural, but there was something in their expressions, something mysterious, something that made me suspicious. My perfect life began to crack at the seams. Have you ever felt like something is wrong, but couldn't quite put your finger on what it is? It was like a tiny voice in my head screaming, "Look closer. Something is happening right in front of you." I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. Maybe I was tired or overthinking things. But deep down, I knew what I was seeing wasn't just a coincidence. And with each passing day, these small moments started to form a bigger picture. The question was I ready to find out what that picture revealed? I had always believed our trust was unbreakable. We were the kind of couple who could tell each other anything. But at some point, something changed. At first, it was small things, so minor that I didn't even pay attention to them. But over time, these small nuances began to paint a troubling picture I couldn't ignore. My wife had always been someone who valued family time. We would spend evenings together cooking, watching movies, or just talking. But one day, she started changing her habits. It all began with her work. She told me there were a lot of new projects and that her boss constantly demanded she stay late. Of course, I believed her. How could I not? But her late hours at work started happening more and more frequently. At first, it was once or twice a week, but over time, it became almost a daily occurrence. She came home late, sometimes even after I had already gone to bed. And every time I asked her, "How was your day?" she would respond briefly, as if avoiding details. Another strange change was how she began treating her phone. It used to always be on the table or near us, and she didn't care who saw it. But now her phone was always with her, even when she went to the bathroom. It was constantly locked, and even if I happened to pass by, she would hold it tightly, as if afraid I might see something. Once I joked, "Why are you guarding your phone so much? Do you have some secret business going on there?" She just smiled and said, "Oh, there's nothing interesting in there." But her eyes betrayed her. There was something in them I hadn't seen before. Tension, maybe even fear. One moment in particular stayed with me. It was a regular evening when she came home later than usual. I was sitting in the living room watching TV when she walked in. I noticed that her demeanor was strangely excited, but not tired, as you'd expect after a long workday. I asked, "Is everything okay? You look different." She replied, "Oh yes, everything's fine, just a long day." And then it happened. She called me by another name. It was just one word, one sound, but it struck me like a lightning bolt. I asked, "What did you just say?" She fell silent and then began to excuse herself, as if it were just a simple slip of the tongue. "Oh, sorry, it's just that I've been talking to my co-workers so much today that I must have mixed things up." Maybe anyone else would have accepted that explanation, but not me. That moment stayed with me like a scar. I didn't know whose name it was, but I knew it meant something more than just a mistake. That night, lying in bed, I couldn't sleep. Her words echoed in my mind. A long day, co-workers, slip of the tongue. But something about it didn't add up. I began noticing even more small things. She grew more nervous whenever I asked even the simplest questions. Her answers were short, sometimes even curt. She started avoiding eye contact, whereas before, she had always looked directly at me when we spoke. Sometimes I would hear her talking on the phone in another room. They were always short conversations, but her voice was quiet, almost a whisper. When I entered the room, she would immediately stop talking and say something like, "Oh, it's just a co-worker from work." But why did she end the conversation the moment I walked in? I started doubting everything. What had happened to the woman I knew? What had happened to the wife I trusted as much as I trusted myself? Was I making all of this up? Or perhaps the truth was hidden in the little details I noticed every day. With each passing day, the tension grew. I felt like something was looming, like a storm about to explode. I just didn't know when it would happen or if I'd be ready for what I would find out. I've always believed that the worst moments in life come unexpectedly. You could be going about your routine, planning your evening, or just trying to get through the day as usual, and suddenly something happens that changes everything. That's exactly what happened that evening. I remember walking into that restaurant. It was an ordinary day, and I had planned to meet up with a friend I hadn't seen in a long time. We had agreed to discuss a few work matters over dinner. The restaurant was cozy, dimly lit, with soft music playing in the background. Nothing special, just a place where people came to enjoy their meals and relax. I walked in, looked around for my friend, and suddenly my heart stopped. In the far corner of the restaurant, at a small table, I saw two people I never expected to see together in that place. My wife and my father. They were sitting close to each other, their faces leaning in, talking so quietly that even if I had been standing next to them, I wouldn't have heard a word. They looked like two people sharing something deeply personal. Her smile wasn't the one I was used to seeing at home. It was gentle, but there was something hidden in it, something I couldn't decipher. At first, I tried to calm myself down. Maybe it's something related to a celebration? I thought. After all, my father's birthday had been not long ago. Or maybe they were discussing some family matter I wasn't yet aware of. But the more I watched, the more I felt an uneasy sensation creep over me. Their faces looked as if they were having a conversation they were trying to keep secret. I hesitated. Should I go over to them or not? What could this mean? In the end, I decided to approach them. When they saw me, their reactions were unexpected. Her eyes widened, and she leaned back slightly as if trying to hide her surprise. My father tried to appear calm, but I noticed how he nervously adjusted his tie. "Oh, hi," she said with that fake smile I had recently come to recognize. "What are you doing here?" "That's what I should be asking you," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady, though the tension was clear. She laughed, a bit nervously, and said, "Oh, your father and I just decided to talk about a surprise for you. But now you've ruined it." Surprise? I wanted to believe her. I wanted to think it was just some innocent meeting she was trying to keep secret for something good. But there was something in her eyes, something I couldn't ignore. Her look wasn't the same as usual. It was guilty. My father added, "Yes, we just wanted to discuss a few things about your work. You know how much I love helping you." His voice sounded confident, but I noticed his hand tremble slightly as he reached for his glass of water. I forced myself to sit down with them at the table. We talked, but the entire conversation felt like a scene from a poorly written play. They both tried to appear natural, but every move they made seemed staged. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. When I left, her words still echoed in my mind. "A surprise for you." But what kind of surprise would involve a secret meeting like this? Why were they here, at a restaurant far from home? And why did I feel like there was a hidden story between them? That encounter became a turning point. I started doubting everything I thought I knew. My reality began to crumble, slipping through my fingers like sand. I didn't know who to trust, or if trust was even possible anymore. After that meeting, I could no longer look at things with the eyes of someone who trusted. What once seemed like minor details now looked like pieces of a puzzle forming a troubling picture. Every time I saw them together, my suspicions grew. But what tormented me most were the moments when I noticed things I hadn't seen before. Let's start with the dinners. We often invited my father over for dinner, and it used to be a joy for me. We'd sit at the table, joke, and reminisce about old stories. But now, those dinners became a nightmare. I started noticing how they exchanged strange glances. At first, it seemed like a coincidence, but when it happened repeatedly, I realized it wasn't just my imagination. One evening, as I was leaving the room, I overheard my father say something to her that made me stop in my tracks. His voice was low, but his tone was one I'd never heard before. "We need to be more careful." More careful? What was he talking about? My wife, usually lively and cheerful during dinners, began acting differently. She avoided direct conversations with me, and it seemed like her attention was always elsewhere. When I looked into her eyes, she quickly looked away, and her phone became even more off-limits than before. It was always on silent mode, and every time it vibrated, she would take it with her into another room. The worst part happened one evening when I heard her talking on the phone in the bedroom. Her voice was so quiet that I couldn't make out the words, but her tone was anxious, almost intimate. I walked into the room and asked, "Who are you talking to?" She quickly replied, "Oh, it's just one of the girls from work." But her face gave her away. She looked nervous, and her hands were trembling slightly. That was the final straw. I needed the truth, and I decided I would find it at any cost. The next day, I did something I never thought I'd do. I bought a hidden camera. It was a small device that could easily be concealed anywhere. I knew it looked like paranoia, but I couldn't live with the uncertainty anymore. I set it up in the living room, as that was where they often stayed alone when I was in another room or out of the house. For the first few days, I didn't notice anything unusual. The camera recorded ordinary, everyday moments. Them drinking coffee, talking about the weather, or discussing TV shows. I even started doubting myself, wondering if I was losing my mind. But then the moment I feared the most happened. It was an evening when I stayed late at work. When I got home, they both acted completely normal, as they always did. But when I reviewed the recordings, I saw and heard something that made my blood run cold. The footage showed my father sitting next to my wife on the couch. Their faces were serious, and she said quietly, "We need to decide what to do next. I can't keep living like this." His response was even more shocking. "I know, but we need to keep this a secret, or he'll ruin everything." I couldn't believe my ears. What did they mean? What were they hiding? Why did she say she couldn't live like this anymore? At that moment, my heart was beating so loudly I could barely think. That recording changed everything. I could no longer ignore what was happening right in front of me. I didn't know what would come next, but I knew one thing. My world would never be the same again. The evening began like any other. I came home, changed clothes, and sat down for dinner. My wife acted as usual, smiling, asking how my day had been, then going about her usual routine. My father hadn't been over for a few days, and I started to think that maybe it was all in my head, everything I had seen and felt before. But deep down, there was a voice that wouldn't let me rest. It whispered, "You're not imagining this. Something is really happening." So after dinner, when my wife went to the bedroom, I decided to check the recordings from the camera. I connected the camera to my laptop and started reviewing the footage. The first few minutes were uneventful. My wife was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone, and then my father arrived. Their faces were calm, and the conversation began quietly, with nothing alarming at first. But then a few minutes in, everything changed. On the recording, I saw my father leaning closer to her. His hand touched her shoulder, and she didn't pull away. Instead, she turned toward him, and their faces were so close that I could barely breathe as I watched the screen. And then it happened. They hugged, not the way friends or family members hug. It was something more. His hand slid down her back, and her fingers gently touched his face. At that moment, my world started to crumble. I couldn't believe my eyes. My mind refused to accept what I was seeing on the screen. This has to be a joke, right? This is some ridiculous coincidence. They're just discussing something and accidentally acting like, but I couldn't finish the thought. What was happening on the recording was undeniable. A few minutes later, I can barely put it into words. They kissed. Long, passionately, like two people who had been more than just acquaintances or family for a long time. I felt the blood rush to my head, and my heart pounded so hard I could barely breathe. I turned off the recording and sat there, staring at the blank screen. In that moment, it felt like my entire world, everything I had built, everything I cherished, had been destroyed in an instant. Anger, pain, betrayal. These feelings washed over me in a wave that made it impossible to think rationally. How could they do this to me? My wife, the woman I loved more than life itself. My father, the man I considered my hero, my role model. I remembered all the moments I had trusted them, how I had shared my fears, how I had talked about how happy I was to have both of them in my life. And now, all of it turned out to be a lie. I began to recall all the suspicious moments I had ignored, the strange conversations, the late nights at work, the phone calls. It had all been there, right in front of my eyes, but I didn't want to believe it. I stood up and started pacing around the room, trying to figure out what to do. My mind felt empty, yet full of so many thoughts that they blended into a chaotic stream. Should I confront them? Should I ask them directly, "How could you do this to me?" Or should I just disappear, walk away, and leave it all behind? That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in the darkness, staring at the ceiling, feeling an emptiness take over my heart. The pain of betrayal was so intense that I felt it physically. It was like a deep wound that would never heal. Now I knew the truth, but was I ready to live with it? After that night, after seeing the recording, I could no longer live in denial. I was torn apart by a storm of emotions. Pain, anger, despair. But most of all, a burning need to hear an explanation. How could they do this? What had I done to deserve such a betrayal? I didn't want to guess anymore. I wanted to hear the truth from their own lips. I decided not to delay any longer. The next evening, when my father came over to our house, I knew the time had come. The room was filled with a tense silence. My wife was in the kitchen preparing dinner, holding a towel in her hands, while my father sat in the living room with a newspaper. They acted as if nothing had happened, but I knew the truth. My heart was pounding so loudly it felt as if it would burst from my chest. I stepped into the living room, stopped between them, and said, "Sit down. We need to talk." Their faces changed instantly. My wife turned to me, startled, clutching the towel, while my father lowered the newspaper, his expression frozen. "What's going on?" she asked, trying to appear calm, but her voice trembled. I took a deep breath and said, "I know everything. I saw the recordings. How could you do this to me?" Her face turned pale, and her eyes darted around, searching for something to say. My father sat silently, staring at the floor, but his clasped hands betrayed his nervousness. "Listen," she began, but I interrupted her. "No, you'll do the talking now. I want to know how you both could do this to me. You knew how much I trusted you, how much I loved you both. What is this? Was I so blind?" Her eyes filled with tears, and she whispered, "It's not what you think. Not what I think." I nearly shouted. "I saw everything on the recordings. The hugs, the kisses, and more. Don't tell me it's not what I think. Then what is it? Explain it to me." My father finally lifted his head and spoke. "We didn't mean for this to happen. We didn't want this. His voice was quiet, but every word felt like a slap to my face. Didn't mean for it to happen? I yelled. Then why did it happen? How long has this been going on? She burst into tears, speaking through sobs. We couldn't stop. We tried. We knew it was wrong, but it happened. It just happened. Just happened. I could barely control myself, my hands trembling with the urge to throw something across the room. That's your excuse? That's your explanation? My father added, his voice heavy with guilt. We tried to keep it a secret so you wouldn't find out. We didn't want to hurt you. Didn't want to hurt me? I laughed bitterly. Her tears no longer moved me. They only irritated me. As for my father, that was a separate story. After I made my wife leave, he started calling me, texting me, trying to find a way to talk. But every time I saw his name on my phone, I felt a wave of disgust. How could he do this to me? The man who taught me honesty, respect, and trust. He had broken all those principles himself. He came to my house, knocked on the door, and left notes on the porch. In one of them, he wrote, "Son, I know I made a mistake, but you will always be my son. Please give me a chance to explain." Explain? What could he possibly explain? Were there any words that could justify his betrayal? Every time I thought about it, it felt like the wound reopened all over again. It was hard to move on. I started avoiding people, even my closest friends. I didn't want to tell this story to anyone because it felt so humiliating. Everyone I knew always said I had the perfect family. How could I now explain to them that it was all a lie? The last time I saw my father was the hardest moment for me. It was a few months after everything happened. He showed up at my house unannounced. I opened the door, saw him, and was about to close it, but he extended his hand to stop me. "Please, son, just give me a minute," he said, and I saw tears glistening in his eyes. I don't know why, but I let him in. We sat in the kitchen, and he began to speak. "I know that nothing I say will change what happened. I know you'll probably never forgive me. But I want you to know one thing. I never wanted this to go so far. I made a mistake. I got lost in my feelings. And I regret it every single day." His voice trembled, and I sat silently, staring at the table in front of me. "Why?" I finally asked. "Why did you do this to me? I trusted you more than anyone else in this world." "I don't know," he replied. "It was weakness. I know it sounds pathetic, but I lost control. And now I've lost you." I lifted my head, looked him straight in the eyes, and said, "You didn't just lose me. You destroyed everything we had between us. You're no longer my hero. You're no longer my family." Those were the last words I said to him. He sat there, nodding silently, as if he understood there was nothing more he could do. Then he stood up, looked at me one last time, and said, "I will always love you, even if you hate me." He left, and that was the last time I saw him. After everything that happened, I was left alone with the biggest question of my life. Why? Why did she do it? Why did my father do this to me? I tried to find answers, but every time I thought about it, it only reopened the wound that hadn't even begun to heal. In the first days after the breakup, I felt like I was trapped in a vacuum. Everything around me felt foreign. Things that used to bring me joy now felt empty. I could no longer sit in the same living room where they had embraced. I couldn't look at the family photos that had once adorned our walls. I began avoiding people, even my closest friends, because I didn't know how to explain what had happened. I didn't know how to put into words the complete destruction of the life I thought I knew. The next step was finding a new purpose in life. I started doing things I had always wanted to, but never had time for. I signed up for courses I had long planned to take, began traveling more, and even tried volunteering. Every new day became a small victory over the pain I carried within me. But the truth is, the pain never truly goes away. It changes, it becomes less sharp, but it stays with you like a scar on your heart. I realized that I would never completely rid myself of these memories. And that's okay. They're a part of me, a part of my story. One day, during my travels, I met someone who shared wisdom with me that will stay with me forever. They said, "Pain is a lesson. It didn't come to destroy you. It came to show you that you can survive more than you ever thought possible." Those words changed how I viewed the situation. I began to see this chapter of my life not as an ending, but as a new beginning. Yes, it was a painful experience, but it also gave me something valuable: strength. Strength to move forward, even when it felt impossible. I started building new relationships, but this time I was much more cautious. I learned to trust again, but not blindly. I began to value myself and my boundaries more. It didn't happen overnight. It was a long process, but every step forward made me stronger. One day, I even received a message from my ex-wife. She wrote, "I know my words won't change what happened, but I want you to know that I regret everything. You deserve to be happy, and I hope you find that happiness." That message didn't make me forgive her entirely, but it helped me realize that holding onto resentment no longer served a purpose. She made her choices, and now I'm making mine. My father also tried to reconnect several times, but I decided that some ties are better left in the past. He will always be my father, but there's no longer a place for him in my life. That was one of the hardest lessons to learn, but it was necessary for my healing. Now, when I look at my life, I don't see ruins. I see a new foundation. I'm not the person I was before. I am stronger, wiser, and now I know for sure that I will never allow anyone to treat me that way again. And here's what I want to say to you if you're listening to this story. Betrayal can break you. It can pull the ground out from under you, make you doubt yourself and the entire world. But it can also make you stronger. The choice is yours. You can't change the past, but you can control your future. And your future isn't defined by others. It's defined by the choices you make. Now I look ahead. The scars remain, but they remind me that I survived the worst. And if I could get through that, I can handle anything. Cuarto. The silence and loneliness became unbearable. I realized that this couldn't go on. If I stayed in this darkness, it would consume me entirely. So I decided to fight back, even though I didn't know where to start. I began by searching for answers. I read everything I could find about betrayal, its causes, its consequences. Books, articles, forums, all of it became my refuge, though every word cut deeply. I learned that betrayal is rarely straightforward. It's not always about hatred or indifference. Sometimes it's about weakness, about emotional chaos that people can't control. But could that ever justify what they had done? One day, I came across an article about emotional betrayal and how it can begin without any intention. It made me wonder, could it really not have been their goal? Could they have truly not realized how far it had gone? But even if that was the case, how could I accept it? I started talking to friends. It was hard. At first, I couldn't even bring myself to say the words. My wife and my father. But when I finally mustered the courage to share my story, I found that many of them responded with understanding and compassion. One of my friends said, "You can't find answers where there are none. Sometimes people do stupid things that don't make sense. But this isn't your fault." His words stuck with me. Was it really not my fault? Because, honestly, part of me felt responsible too. Maybe I had missed something in our relationship. Maybe I hadn't been attentive enough to her feelings. But then I realized that these were just my fears and doubts trying to impose logic where there was none. Occasionally, I thought about forgiveness. My mother always taught me that forgiveness is the only way to free yourself from pain. But how could I forgive something so devastating? How could I look those people in the eye and say, "I don't hold it against you anymore"? I even started seeing a therapist because I knew I couldn't handle this on my own. They helped me see that forgiveness isn't always about others. It's more about you, about your ability to let go of the pain so you can move forward. They told me, forgiveness doesn't mean accepting their actions. It means no longer letting their actions control your life. Those words made me think, could I ever truly forgive them? Did I even want to? But the main question that haunted me wasn't about forgiveness. It was about moving forward. How do you live on when what once grounded you has fallen apart? How do you find trust in people again? I started with small steps. I changed the environment in my home. I took down all the photos, replaced the furniture that reminded me of them. I started exercising because physical activity helped me deal with the anger and despair. Most importantly, I began reconnecting with friends. Every time I told my story, I felt the burden lift just a little. But at the same time, each conversation exposed my vulnerability. And you know what? That was liberating. I stopped bottling everything inside. I realized that strength isn't about hiding your feelings, but about expressing them honestly. At this stage of my life, the question of why no longer held the same weight as it once did. I realized that some answers simply don't make sense. And that's okay. Sometimes the best thing you can do is let go and move on, even if the past still tries to pull you back. Life after such a blow is like trying to piece together a broken vase. Even if you find all the shards and glue them back together, the cracks will remain forever. And yet I decided I wouldn't stay at the bottom of this pit. In the end, betrayal can destroy you, but only if you let it. My first task was to create a new life for myself. I realized that every detail in my house, every habit, reminded me of them. So, I started with external changes. I got rid of the furniture we had chosen together and replaced it with new pieces that reflected only my taste. The walls that once held our shared photos were now bare. It was painful, but it was necessary. Over time, those small changes started to make a difference. They were symbols of reclaiming my space, my identity, and with every step I took to rebuild my life, I began to see that the cracks in my vase didn't define me. They were simply part of my story, a story of survival, resilience, and the decision to move forward.